Hello, welcome back. This is Mr. Kirkhausen again. Welcome to Cold War Part 3. Right now I'm going to be talking about the proxy wars that went on during the Cold War. Now, as you can remember, the Cold War was a conflict between the United States and Western Europe and the Soviet Union. Again, it was called a Cold War because there was never any direct battle between the two sides. And if there was, it would have been a regular war or a hot war. That's why it's called a Cold War. However, there were some armed conflicts, some of them that went on for a few years. Some of them were short, some of them were long, but they were all very, very important part of the Cold War. And these smaller wars were called proxy wars. Now, what is a proxy? A proxy is basically a smaller country that is supported or kind of controlled by a larger country. Now, if we look at the definition here, proxy warfare are two countries avoiding direct war. Instead, they are supporting combatants in smaller wars that serve their interests. So the two superpowers, the USA and Western Europe versus the Soviet Union Eastern world, each supported different sides in smaller wars. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the proxy wars. Again, here are our two sides. We have the United States and Western Europe, and then on the other, which is the Western Bloc versus the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. Now, here are our Cold War hotspots that we're going to be looking at. In Part 1, we're going to be looking at the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and then in our second part, Part 2 of Proxy Wars, we'll take a look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was not exactly a war, but more of a kind of one-time little incident that kind of wasn't a really fully drawn-out war, but more like a very tense period in history. The other one is the Afghanistan War, which we'll get into a little bit more in the next part. But again, these are the Cold War hotspots that actually took place in countries that were not either in the Western Bloc or the Eastern Bloc. So we have Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, which was in Central Asia, and Cuba, which is actually in the Caribbean, 80 miles south of Miami. Okay, first is the Korean War. Now, a little background on the Korean War. Korea was actually occupied by Japan before World War II started, and when Japan was defeated and kind of expelled from the country, the two sides that really helped defeat Japan, the Soviet Union and the United States, couldn't really figure out what to do with Korea, which had been totally destroyed during the war. So what they decided to do was divide the country in two to kind of help rebuild it. And then they were supposed to have some elections go on. But what happened as the Soviet Union and the United States continued to have more disagreements, the country remained divided, where the communist side, which was the North, which is North Korea, and then the democratic side was South Korea. So what happened in 1950 was the North, kind of led by its president Kim Il-sung, decided to invade South Korea and unite the country as one large communist country. Now, if we think back to the Marshall Plan and the idea of containment, which is to not let communism spread outside where it already is, and the idea of domino theory, if we let one country fall, then more will fall, the United States decided to intervene quickly. So as the North kind of kept pushing down into the country, then the United States showed up and kind of helped the push the communists back. Now, the war ended up going on for 4 years. Different sides had advantages at different points. At one point, the South, led by the United States, almost took over the entire country and made the whole country democratic. However, China intervened on behalf of the North Koreans, and of course the Soviet Union gave a lot of support to North Korea, and basically the war ended kind of where it started. There is a line which you can see here. It's known as the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel is the line that divides North Korea and South Korea today. So the mission for the United States, if you kind of think about it in terms of what was the overall goal, if we look down at question number 4, was communism contained or expanded? Communism was definitely contained because the North was unable to take over the South, but because the United States and the South Koreans couldn't get a decisive victory over North Korea and China with the help of the Soviet Union, again, the war kind of began where it started. And unfortunately, to this day, as many of you know, North Korea is still a communist country. It's almost the last communist country in the world. It's the last totalitarian dictatorship that kind of is a reminder of what life used to be like in the Soviet Union under Stalin. The country is still divided along this line, the 38th parallel. Now, the 38th parallel, as you probably could watch on your own or already watched, the 38th parallel is a very scary line. It is part of an area called the demilitarized zone, in which both sides, the South Korea and North Korea, are not supposed to have any weapons. However, the 38th parallel is kind of lined with landmines, so if anybody tried to cross, they will probably get blown up. And the two sides, the South Koreans and the North Koreans, basically 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, stare at each other with binoculars just in case the other side wants to do something. So as you probably saw in the video, the countries just look at each other all day long. The Korean War never officially ended. The two sides signed a peace, kind of a ceasefire. However, technically, the Korean War has been going on since 1950. So it's in its 70th year, which is crazy. However, there's been no direct fighting since 1953. So in terms of a proxy war, that was the first one, the Korean War. Was it success from the U.S. point of view? It absolutely was. The U.S. contained communism. Now, really quickly, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War went on from 1954 to 1975. And the situation with the Vietnam War is a group known as the North Vietnamese and other groups known as the Viet Cong attempted to make the country of Vietnam into a communist country. So Vietnam was not as divided as Korea was. North Vietnam and South Vietnam. South Vietnam was a free area, whereas North Vietnam was a communist area. And this is a long conflict where the United States supported the South Vietnamese while the Soviet Union supported the North Vietnamese. This battle went on for many, many years. It was a very difficult war in the jungle. It was a war that was very difficult on U.S. troops. They were not used to fighting in the heat and used to fighting in the kind of jungle atmosphere. And ultimately, this is the one war, if you ask historians, have the United States ever lost the war? Some would argue no, but others would say it's the Vietnam War because the mission was ultimately a failure. The North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh actually defeated the U.S. The U.S., after years and years and years of just anger from the U.S. population about this war that kept going on and on and on, decided it was time for the U.S. to leave. After the U.S. left, South Vietnam was quickly defeated by North Vietnam, and it has remained communist to this day. Okay. So what did the U.S. and its allies want? They wanted to stop the spread of communism into Vietnam. The Soviet Union wanted to make it communist, and as a result, was communism contained or expanded? It was absolutely expanded. Vietnam went to a communist country. South Vietnam became communist, and to this day, the country is still communist. So these are two examples of the Korean War and the Vietnam War when the Cold War turned hot. Okay, so these were examples of proxy wars. And we're going to talk about two other proxy wars or issues in the next part. Thank you for listening, and see you again in part 4, Cold War part 4, Proxy War part 2.